So the year is 2015. You've just opened up a fresh pack of cards, and in it, you found a foil Tarmogoyf. Now, you're in the top 8, but what do? Do you take the Tarmogoyf, even though there is a much better option in the pack for your draft, or do you take the better option and pass the $300 to $500 Tarmogoyf that's sitting right in front of you? I think you know the answer. You take the Goyf. And in a similar fashion, we are going to take all of the Goyfs into our deck with DISA the Restless. So DISA is a 5-mana Jund commander. She is 2 black, red, and green for a human scout with 5/6 stat line. And whenever a Lhurogy permanent card is put into your graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, put it onto the battlefield. And whenever one or more creatures you control, they don't have to be Goyfs, deal combat damage to a player, you make a Tarmogoyf token. So this card is very interesting and versatile. It sort of wants us to do 2 primary things, but most importantly, it involves the Lhurogy type, and that does include the OG Tarmogoyf, which is pretty sweet. And I think for a lot of people, that's what inspired the build path for DISA. She's actually quickly become one of the more popular commanders to build from the recent Modern Horizons 3 release, and I will say the actual precon that she came out in is pretty good, but I think that we can do quite a bit better. I think that we need to first sort of analyze exactly what DISA wants us to do. So let's take a look at that first ability where a Lhurogy permanent is put into the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield. We then get to put it onto the battlefield. This, in essence, is sort of the bread and butter of this deck. There's a lot of setup pieces and support pieces that are synergistic with her, but primarily this is going to be the primary synergy of our deck. And I think that talking about the play experience is going to be the most helpful. There's plenty of things that exist in our deck that will allow us to mill cards, such as the Aftermath Analysts and Stitcher Suppliers of the world, but also some heavy hitters like Mesmeric Orb and also the Palantirs of Orthonk. All of these cards are great synergistic pieces that allow us to self-mill, and we also have effects that allow us to reanimate certain creatures in the event that we don't have our commander on the board. But primarily, the sort of core of our strategy is going to be self-milling ourselves. And don't get it twisted, this is half of the puzzle, because once we've self-milled enough, especially if we have DISA on the battlefield and we've got a chance to return our creatures, we are now sort of becoming more of a combat-focused deck. And really, if you watch any DISA or if you watch any person play DISA, typically the method that they are winning is through combat damage specifically. So we have to get creative about the sort of heavy hitters or the bigger payoffs in the deck that are going to get us over the finish line once we have sort of accomplished the first goal of milling ourselves, and then hopefully the second goal of getting DISA out uninterrupted and then reanimating something. In my experience with this deck, this commander doesn't really mind to go very long into the late game, but you would much prefer to sort of cut things off a bit sooner, because ultimately you're still in sort of a Reanimator package with effects like Incarnation Technique, for example. And the reason that I say DISA doesn't really fully mind to go a bit into the late game is that on every damage that we are ticking away on our opponents, as long as we're able to get in and do some type of damage to each of them, we're generating 3 Tarmogoyf tokens at every single combat. And that's just a ton of value. As long as the Tarmogoyf is maxed out on the permanents, or the different card types that exist in the graveyards of our opponents and our own, the lowest stat line that I've seen them is like a 6/7 or a 5/6 at the lowest, I would say. So if you're generating an average of 15 power and 18 toughness every combat, and eventually, hopefully, there's not going to be as much removal to continuously keep the board clean. The Cyclonic Rifts of the world, the board wipes, etc. That's what allows DISA to sort of get into the mid to late game. But that's just the basics for our commander here. We need to sort of dive a little bit deeper into some of the synergy pieces and interactions that exist with this deck. And I also have some thoughts on cards that you really shouldn't be running. And one of them is a little bit controversial. So we might as well start with that one. So let's first talk about Ashes of the Fallen and Masid Nexus. So Masid Nexus makes all creatures, all types, in all zones. So it's going to trigger DISA whenever you typically mill a creature into the graveyard, for example. Now, this also works with Ashes of the Fallen, and that one reads whenever it enters the battle, whenever it is in the graveyard, it becomes that type. Now, there's a little bit of discussion online, a little bit of confusion about how this interaction works with DISA. It works how you want it to. because the permanent is going to be entering into the graveyard, which will then statically simply become a Lhurogy because of the way the state-based actions are checked. And then DISA will see that a Lhurogy has entered the graveyard, and then you can simply reanimate it, for instance, for free. And that's really good if you get something like an Atali, for instance. And my hot take here is that Conspiracy, which is the other version of this effect, should not be played. Now, I think you can play it, don't get me wrong, but it's 5 mana with 2 black pips. It's a bit hungry on the mana cost when we could be doing something else with our mana. I think that it's just a little bit too clunky, and in my playtesting, I found that oftentimes I didn't really want to spend the 5 mana on Conspiracy when I could easily spend 4 on a Masid Nexus or even 2 on the Ashes of the Fallen. So I would really consider maybe not actually including Conspiracy. If you think it's going to fit your playgroup and you're able to get away with a slower build path, then I would say go for it. But at least for me, it didn't work out very well. As mentioned, we are a combat-focused deck. And in the precon, I believe it was this precon, the Relic Cleaver was reprinted. And that one generates treasure tokens when damage is dealt to a player. It's a great card, and I actually included it in my list because I felt like it synergized excellently with our typical plan that we're going for. Oftentimes, even just having a regular like Polygoyf or Tarmogoyf or Pyrogoyf on the battlefield that's already going to be a sizable threat, equipped with the Relic Cleaver, generates a lot of extra treasure for us to forward our game plan. But there's another equipment actually that I thought was really quite key. I'm sorry, it's not equipment, it's just an artifact, I believe, but it's Whip of Erebos. And basically the main reason that we're playing Whip of Erebos is to give everything on our board lifelink. We are, like I mentioned, a combat-focused deck. So having lifelink on all of our creatures with very aggressive stat lines typically leads to us gaining a ton of life, and the swings are quite insane. And not only that, it also has this additional synergy to just bring something back for 4 mana. So for 2 black, you tap it, and then you get to return something to the battlefield with haste from your graveyard, and then I believe it gets exiled. Yes, it gets exiled at the beginning of the next end step. But importantly, we have a lot of ETB effects like Massacre Worm or Atali, for instance, in this deck, where a modestly costed 4 mana on an equipment that's already doing good things for us in our deck really helps out the consistency of this deck, because you're not always going to have a reanimation spell in hand. But if you can play Whip of Erebos, get away with giving everything lifelink, and incidentally, you just get to reanimate things at a later stage, it's really good. And it's been a fantastic card that I haven't seen really show up in other people's lists, so I would really consider giving it a look for DISA. Likewise, another card that I found really sort of not key necessarily, but really good on the inclusion list is Maggus of the Wheel. So you know him, you love him, so it's a 3 mana red creature that allows you to basically Wheel of Fortune your hand away, but it requires him to tap. So that's really the only drawback, is you're paying additional mana, tapping, and then you're having to wheel your hand away after that. But a lot of the time, we are going to be in a position where we're maybe stuck with 1 or 2 creatures in our hand that we don't necessarily want anyway. I found this happens actually all the time whenever I play Reanimator, and being able to discard them in mass away to the graveyard for relatively fair cost, and by proxy also trigger DISA if she's on the battlefield, typically reanimating whatever it is that we just threw away into the bin, is really great. And then we just draw a fresh 7. So not only are we sort of going card positive because we are sending cards to the graveyard, which then get reanimated by DISA, we also just get a fresh grip, which allows us to then, yes, cast more spells or new creatures, or allow us to mill ourselves, which triggers DISA again. It's just very busted. I would actually consider running even more wheel effects in the deck, but things like Wheel of Misfortune I find are a bit too confusing, let's use that word, at the board. And on top of that, effects like just regular Wheel of Fortune tend to be way too expensive for the average play group. But I think this is a decent compromise because it also counts as a creature. And if you do happen to have one of those things like Masid Nexus on the board, it'll just get reanimated for free. I think it's a good include, and I was actually very happy with it whenever I had it on the board. Now, I've already basically mentioned some of our top-end finishers. So Atali, you know him, you love him. ETB, everybody reveals until they hit a non-land card, and you just get to cast it for free. That card ends games really fast, and on top of that, if you have enough mana, flip it for Infect. great card here. And likewise, Terror of the Peaks is another card. And I'm going to sort of couple Terror of the Peaks here with Pyrogoyf, because Pyrogoyf is going to trigger on a majority of our deck anyway. And they do very similar things where upon something enters the battlefield, you get to deal damage equal to its power to any target. And the reason that I wanted to throw something like a Terror of the Peaks in here is because I wanted the redundancy. I wanted more of that ability to sort of ping everybody down, because when we're making 15 or maybe 18 power of Tarmogoyfs every single turn rotation, it turns out that that ends games almost immediately with multiple redundant effects like this on the board, even with just one of them. If we only have Terror of the Peaks or we only have Pyrogoyf, for instance, we're still just like doinking people for 15 every single turn rotation. It's really quite good. And it's important to note too that Terror of the Peaks is a flyer, so if it gets to stick around till our turn, it gives us an easier method of hitting people. It's something that maybe is not immediately inherent, but it really does help with the consistency of the deck. And you can actually do degenerate things without DISA as long as you just have a regular Terror of the Peaks, or honestly just a Pyrogoyf on the board anyway. If you're reanimating big things, then they're both going to see that and say, okay, I'm just going to shoot something for like 8 or 7 or whatever. And that quickly allows you to control the board or close the game out. And the last card that I wanted to sort of mention is one that I definitely simp for a bit. It's Breach the Multiverse. And this card is just great. 7 mana, mill 10, and then you get something back from everybody's graveyard. Again, this is another one of those cards that it tends to just end games very quickly. And if you do have static effects like the Terror of the Peaks on the board, it does even crazier things. But our deck already wants to be milling/self-milling. And in our case, Breach the Multiverse goes along with that plan great. Or we just get to use it at a later stage of the game if our board was even wiped. There's plenty of situations where my board was wiped, and then for 7 mana, it's basically, let's mill. I'll fill up my graveyard. Sometimes I got Bajuka bogged, or my graveyard got exiled somehow, and I get to refill my yard, which is really important. And on top of that, I just get a bunch of threats from other graveyards and my own onto the battlefield, which can sometimes swing the game immediately back in my favor, depending on what they are. There's some inherent randomness with this card, but I think it's so strong by itself that it allows it to make it into the deck, because the best case sort of wet dream scenario is having DISA on the board when we cast Breach the Multiverse. But even if that doesn't happen, I'm not hurt by it. I think it's still a very fair card, and it's one that actually I've seen do pretty impressive things. So I would really encourage you to give it a look if you haven't already. 2 cards that I've seen crop up a few separate times is Deadbridge Chant. I just don't like this card. It's a bit too overcosted, I think, for what it does. Yes, you get the mill off of it, but it's 6 mana for that effect. And for 7 mana, so 1 more mana, you can get a Breach the Multiverse type effect. And yes, it does get to stick around on the board, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to return something, but it's random. It's not something that I like. I do like randomness sort of in moderation, let's call it. But in this circumstance, when we're looking to try to effectively, concisely close out the game, this card just isn't it. It's too inconsistent for my liking, and therefore I cut it from the deck, and I wouldn't encourage you to include it. If you like the randomness, however, I think it's at least worth a look, especially because it's got printed so many times recently. It's like 10 cents now, so you really can't go wrong to at least pick one up and try it. But I think more often than not, it sort of fails to impress. And likewise, I love dredge mechanics, but I think this card doesn't quite make the cut, and that's Shenanigans. So this is just 2 mana, destroy an artifact, but it has dredge, so it's recurable, and you'd get to dredge something into the graveyard, which incidentally could trigger DISA. I think it's a card that is actually something to consider, especially if you're trying to build more on a budget. This card actually puts in a lot of work. It's very cheap to pick up a copy of this card, and I almost included it in my final list, but I think having the flexibility of our removal spells in our deck to remove multiple things is a bit more valuable than only being able to destroy artifacts, despite the utility of having dredge printed directly on this card. And of course, I have all of the good goifs in the deck like everybody else already does. I don't need to beat you to death with all of the different abilities and interactions. They make the deck tick. It's sort of the namesake of the deck. We're going to be including them. There's just one more card that I really want to point out, and that is Chainer Nightmare Adept. So this is 2 and then Rakdos mana, so 4 mana for a 3/2. The reason that we're playing it is because it allows us to discard a card at will, and then you may cast a creature spell from your graveyard this turn. You can only use this once per turn. So This card is great on resets. Being able to play this out at a stage where maybe your board was wiped, you can play Chainer, maybe DISA's on the board already, perhaps we've milled ourselves, and then you play Chainer, we discard something, hopefully it's a Goyf, which then triggers DISA to reanimate it, and we get the ability to cast something additional in our yard. It's really good. Now, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if you didn't cast it from your hand, it gains haste. That is another piece to this puzzle that makes Chainer exceptional, because it turns all of the Goyfs that just happenstance get reanimated by DISA into hasty creatures that can then swing out immediately to generate more Tarmogoyf tokens. It results in a cascade of events where we develop more Tarmogoyf tokens, and you get to sort of a critical mass if your board is not answered, whereupon you just steamroll the game. You just run away with the game. Chainer turns out to be exceptionally good. Not only does it synergize with DISA's first ability, it just synergizes with both abilities, and it makes the deck much more consistent as a result. Now, I know I said that was the last one, but I actually have one more, and that is Smuggler Surprise. So this was recently printed in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It's a 1-mana green instant with Spree, meaning you have to cast the Spree. And again, you have to use a Spree option. You cannot just cast this for green. If that for some reason comes up in your game, you must Spree this card when you cast it, but you can choose any number of these. So for 2 more mana, you mill 4, already looking good, and then you can put up to 2 creatures or lands from among the milled cards into your hand. Probably just going to be land, because if we have DISA out, it allows us to bring back the Goyfs anyway, and then we just get lands incidentally off of this. That's really good rate for 3 mana. And then on top of that, you can pay 4 and a green extra. So if you did this with the other ability, it's 3 plus 5, which is 8 mana total. And that gets us the ability, you may put up to 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. As I mentioned, we have a lot of ETB effects in this deck already, so being able to just get them out of our hand is great. I always hate being in a Reanimator deck where things feel stuck in our hand, so for the low cost of, if you wanted just 6 mana, you could just only Spree it once with just dumping things onto the board, like the Atalis, like the Massacre Worms, etc. It gets a lot of value for very little, and this is also an instant, importantly, so you could also just hold this up at somebody's end step to flash something in, essentially. Give it pseudo flash, I guess you can call it. There is one final ability. It's for 1 extra. Creatures with power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Remember, like I mentioned before, our Tarmogoyfs are typically going to be bigger than the 4 anyway. So having this card with the extra versatility to be a sort of protection spell, it just gives it 1 extra tick in the positive column for us. So I think Smuggler Surprise is just great. Sorry about that. And then I think that this card really should go, or you should at least consider it for basically every DISA deck. It sort of checks every box that you want to accomplish with DISA. So like I said, that's really about it. This is a really straightforward sort of commander deck because it's just Goyf Tribal with Reanimator stapled on there. It's just a matter of nuance of a few specific choices, and I think I nailed it down pretty well for you. So if you want, you can view my deck list down in the description below, and I would encourage you to go and check that out once you're done with this video. And I want to thank everybody that got to the point in this video. If you did, I would really love if you would subscribe. I would really appreciate that as the channel continues to grow. It means that I get to do more crazy things like this, where I basically take a week just to make material for you guys to enjoy. And really, it was more than a week. It was multiple weeks long of playtesting and building and deconstructing and whatnot. But you get the point. It really cements to me that what I'm doing is worthwhile and you guys are getting something out of this. So if you do enjoy it, I would really encourage you to subscribe and also share with people that you love. But that's it for this one. Thank you so much for being here and tuning in to watch this. I've been Kyle, and I'll see you very soon, actually tomorrow, for one final video of our week of content. And until then, I'll see you next time. Bye.